Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston's webinar, an economic update with Anirban Basu. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Marty Fletcher, Managing Partner of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As you know, this has been a unique time, both in our country's history and certainly in our economic history. And we thought that our friends around the country would enjoy and benefit from hearing from a noted economist about the trends that he's seen in the economy and where he sees the balance of this year and next year headed. We're pleased to have with us Anirban Basu. He is an advisor to many industry groups, an advisor to many companies, and an advisor to governments on economic issues. He's going to speak to you for about 45 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions afterwards. We're expecting quite a few questions, so we'll probably be limited to a half dozen or so that we can get to in the balance of the program. With that, I'm very pleased to turn the platform over to Anirban Basu.
Thank you very much, Marty. Thank you to Whiteford, Taylor, Preston for creating this venue and allowing us to chat together about where the economy is and where it appears to be headed based on the best available information and some intelligent, I hope, speculation. I have entitled the presentation today, Return of the Economist. It is a Lord of the Rings themed presentation. There's lots of ways to start such an affair. You know, a lot of people like to do things, but start by with a prayer, a pledge of allegiance. Some even sing the national anthem. I'm a big fan of the ring verse, which goes thusly: 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them. You will see this organizational framework throughout the webinar: 9, 7, 3, 1, 9 rings for the kingdom of men and women, 7 for the dwarves, 3 for the elves, 1 for the dark lord. The dark lord, I think we can agree, has been busy on Middle Earth so far in 2020. This graphical element gives us some sense of hotspots around the world. You might remember that back in February and into March, there was a lot of discussion about whether warm weather was an antidote, or at least a partial antidote, to the virus. And it is true, I think, that the virus doesn't love very warm temperatures, but you can see here, whether we're talking about Canadian markets or markets in the northern United States or in Mexico, Latin America, Western Africa, wherever we are, close to the equator or far from the equator, we've seen significant infection, over 400,000 deaths globally, over 100,000 deaths in the United States. I know we have folks here from Kentucky and Michigan and the Mid-Atlantic region. I'll be speaking to all those geographies, but hotspots everywhere through the United States. And as you know, one of the concerns has been that the new hotspots emerging in Arizona, parts of Texas, southern Florida, and elsewhere in Florida. We'll talk more about the economic consequences of that as we go through this webinar, but you can clearly see warm weather is not an antidote, neither is hydroxychloroquine, though the Gilead Sciences drug remdesivir apparently has some clinical efficacy. We'll talk about some of the public health issues as well. And of course, this is first and foremost a public health crisis. But Whiteford, Taylor, Preston has asked me to talk about the economy, and that's what I aim to do. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to set the baseline, where we were. And, even though we're talking about this pandemic and we've had considerable loss of life, so on and so forth, there is some good news out there, including on the public health front, that even as we fixate on Arizona, Texas, Latin America, so on and so forth, as emerging hotspots for the virus, If you look globally at cumulative confirmed cases, we've begun to, as a world at least, flatten the curve. New Zealand has declared itself COVID-19 free, for instance, and so it is possible. And you can see sort of at the end of this data series, these data come from Johns Hopkins University, that we have flattened the curve. But again, my job is to talk about the economy, and so let's talk about that. And what is the hope here? The hope is that we can get back to where we had been. Because my goodness, I think you'd agree it was an awfully fine economy. And there is good news. I mean, I'm looking right now at the NASDAQ is up 136 points today, up to 10,192. I know you're amazed. I'm amazed that the stock market's performing so well. The Dow Jones is up nearly 210 points as I'm speaking to you now. And so again, the hope is that we get back to where we had been economically. And where were we economically? We were in a very fine place. We had, together reduced unemployment in this nation at 3.5%, a 50-year low. Just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, I mean, you'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find an unemployment rate as low as it had been pre-crisis. So just to give you a sense again how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you some sense. This is monthly job growth in America, is what you're looking at here, and we had added jobs for 113 consecutive months in America, and over that 113-month winning streak, which was unrivaled in American history, we added 22 million net new jobs. Now, what we've done for you here is we've indexed the data through February of 2020 to the left, on the left-hand axis, and then March, April, and May of 2020 in red, the right-hand axis. Why did we have to do that? Because in April, we lost 20.7 million jobs. So in April itself, we basically countervailed almost completely all the jobs we added during that 113-month winning streak. In March, we lost more than 800,000 jobs. And so, I mean, the point is this, that when you lose 20.7 million jobs in a month, if I put all of these data on one axis, basically all the lines would disappear, save one, April. So, now, again, some good news here. May's jobs report was an absolute stunner. In May, the nation adds 2.5 million jobs. Economists coming into that data release had been predicting that in May, we had lost 8 million jobs, at least economists polled by Dow Jones, so mainly Wall Street economists. Now we added 2.5 million, so economists missed by 10.5 million jobs, which is poor performance by economist standards. So, in some sense, the National Bureau of Economic Research had said, that the recession began in February. You could make the argument that the recession's already over. No, because we're not receding anymore. We're adding jobs now. Now, don't get me wrong. Even if you agree with the proposition, and you may not, that the recession is over, we'll talk more about this as we go through the presentation, obviously we're nowhere close to complete recovery, certainly not on the labor market front. So this shows you job changes between May 2019 and May 2020 by industry. We knew that there are certain people who are more vulnerable to the economic downturn coming into this crisis. We knew that if you're going to have social distancing directives, then people who have to be there to provide the service, physically present in the presence of the customer or client, that they were going to suffer the most. So leisure and hospitality, which lost 6.7 million jobs between May 2019 and May 2020, that's mostly your hotel and restaurant workers. They can't work remotely. Yes, true. DoorDash delivery service providers, those intrepid DoorDash personnel and Grubhub personnel. So that's different. We'll talk about that too. But hotel workers, restaurant workers, retail workers, that's what you find in that retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, utilities category, the second category here. They lost 2.8 million jobs year over year. We're down 17.7 million jobs on a year ago basis. So let's say we keep adding 2.5 million jobs a month, which we won't, by the way, but let's say we do. It's going to take months to get back to where we were. But my guess is probably going to take years, but we'll talk more about that as we get toward the end of this webinar. This just gives you a sense of employment growth or lack thereof for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in our country. I've bolded some of interest here. Again, I know some of you are from Michigan, so I bolded Detroit. That's where you see the highest rate of job loss on a year ago basis. And part of this is a reflection of public health outcomes. So Southeast Michigan became, of course, one of the epicenters of the virus, but also when General Motors, Ford, Chrysler closed their factories, that's going to tend to hit Detroit pretty hard. So Detroit lost a fifth of its jobs, is what I'm trying to say, between May 2019 and May 2020. New York Metro, another epicenter, a hotspot, viral hotspot. 18.1% of its jobs lost between May 2019 and May 2020. Where do we see the least number of jobs lost? Phoenix. Well, Phoenix is now a hotspot. Dallas. Well, Dallas is now a hotspot. San Antonio, ditto. Houston, ditto. Right? Tampa. So, one of the things we're going to look at some point going forward is, did some of these states open up too soon? As infection rates were starting to recede in New York and Southeast Michigan and elsewhere in the northern United States, some of these southern state policymakers may have looked at that and said, look, it's receding, let's open back up. So, among the first to open back up, if not the first, was Governor Kemp of Georgia. He opened up his economy around April 20th. So that was, more than 2 months ago. And so guess what we see now, with the economy reopening, we see more viral spread. Now, that doesn't mean we have to shut down the economy again. But if it is the case that in some areas now, hospital capacity is now, 75% utilized, and we're still seeing rising viral spread, that's an issue. That's a complication for the economic forecast that I'm going to deliver. But again, more on that later. I'm trying to set the baseline. So pre-COVID-19, we had this lovely situation of 3.5% unemployment. That, of course, is over. The unemployment rate in May was 13.3%. Here I'm going to show you three rates of unemployment: in blue, men; in green, women; and in red, total unemployment. During the previous downturn, the so-called Great Recession, men suffered more, relatively speaking, because segments that are male-dominated, like construction and manufacturing, really took it on the chin. The downturn begins with residential construction, for instance. So about 87% of all construction workers in the country are men. So male unemployment rises faster in that cycle. This time it's been different. Women are more aligned with retail trade, leisure and hospitality, daycare centers, schools, and of course, many women have been on the front lines of delivering care. It's an easy majority of American nurses, about 90% are women. So as this virus spread, many of those deliverers of care became sick and were separated from their jobs for that reason. So if you can peer into the data, you'll see that although the overall employment rate was 13.3% for men, it was around 12% in May. For women, about 14%. Every expansion is different. Every recession is different. Obviously, this is very different. This is unemployment rates for the 25 largest metropolitan areas as of April. The May data are still not with us. But where do we see the highest rate of unemployment? Detroit Metro. So some of that is related to, again, public health outcomes, but also structural outcomes. Right? Detroit has more auto manufacturing than most regions of the country, of course, and so when those plants shut down, you're going to tend to feel it more in Detroit, whether it's part suppliers or actual Ford, GM, Chrysler. New York Metro, high unemployment. Philly Metro, that's what we saw in the Northeast. Orlando at number 21 here, high unemployment. Well, Disney shuts down, right? Orlando has lots going for it, right? It's got higher education, it's got a burgeoning IT sector, but largely it's about leisure and hospitality, right? You got to be there to consume Disney. Disney's no fun on Zoom video. The rides are just not that exciting. Now, the lowest rate of unemployment is Minneapolis, as it turns out, much of the news recently, and Washington, Baltimore, because Washington, Baltimore, though both became hotspots, especially the Washington metropolitan area, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, more stable employment because more federal employment, more federal government contractors, fewer layoffs, more stable. But unemployment is high everywhere, obviously. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of the way life was, and because a lot of the data are quarterly, they don't neatly capture the crisis. So, some of these data are anachronistic, like this one. This is growth in wages and salaries as measured by the U.S. Employment Cost Index. And what I'm showing you is year-over-year percentage change in wages and salaries. And this was only through the first quarter of 2020. So this was fabulous, isn't it? I mean, it's 2/3 of the economy is about consumer spending. Well, more people are working, or were. More people earning more money on the job. Amazon is not a 501c3. They're not a charitable organization. They're for profit all the time, 24/7. So when they raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour, it wasn't for charitable purposes. It was business reasons, recruitment, retention. Bank of America raised its minimum wage to $20 an hour. Again, not for charitable purposes. It was an indicator of a strong labor market. So, just phenomenal. I mean, the issue for many business people out there, pre-crisis at least, was what? You were trying to retain and recruit workers. That was your problem, cobbling together a productive workforce. So from your perspective, perhaps, or some of your perspectives, this growth in wages and salaries is at least to a certain degree problematic because that's your payroll rising. And I'm a small business owner myself, so I'm not a big fan of rising payroll, I have to tell you. I wish there were some payroll holidays once in a while. Once in a while, I wouldn't have to pay my workers, but again, apparently that's illegal. Anyway, so more people working, more people earning more money on the job, and so what were they doing? They were putting stuff in the wagons. They were shopping. Now, I would say the crisis began on March 9th from an American perspective. You say, Anirban, that's nuts. They call this COVID-19 for a reason, sir. It's called COVID-19 because it was discovered in 2019. Fair point. I don't disagree. But the reason I say March 9th is that's when the stock market in the United States actually noticed that there was this emerging pandemic. Until then, stock market didn't seem to notice or care. True enough, the week that included or began March 2nd was choppy for financial markets in the US, but no more than usual. For on March 9th, the Dow Jones falls more than 2,000 points on a single day. And that was, at that time, a record for a daily point decline on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. We also set records on March 12th and then again on March 16th. It was a tough period. You'll remember the Dow Jones went from 29,000 to 18,000 in the blink of an eye. But even though it was March 9th, for the stock market, and March 11th for the NBA, it was not until March 11th that the Utah Jazz are ushered away from the basketball court as their all-star center, Rudy Gobert, is diagnosed with COVID-19. A few days later, his fellow all-star guard forward Donovan Mitchell, the Utah Jazz, a very good team, also was diagnosed. And around that time, the NBA scuttled its season. It's trying to restart it now. But in February, you might remember that you and I were starting to social distance a little bit. Do you remember that? We were fist pumping. We did the elbow bump. We did the kid and play toe tap, if you know what I'm talking about, and you do. So you can see retail sales start to fall in February and then fall off the table in March and April. But then comes May. Economists collectively were expecting that in May, retail sales would rise 7%. They rose 17%. Now, again, they're falling short of where they were previously, but one could argue recovery has already begun. The miracle of the previous economic expansion cycle was this. I had been taught in school, many of you had been taught, that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up, period, full stop, that's it. I mean, when you were tested upon this, if you were tested upon this in Econ 101 or Econ 201, it was not an essay question. This is the Phillips curve. The professor didn't ask you, tell me your feelings about the Phillips curve. How does it make you feel when you hear that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up? That was not the question. The question was true, false. When unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. True, done. That's it. So if I tell you that there was a 50-year low in unemployment, and I also tell you that during the previous crisis, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, our central bank, responded by creating trillions of dollars of new money supply, flooded financial systems with new money. You say, okay, with all this new money, with all this federal government deficit spending, and with unemployment at a 50-year low, oh yeah, we're going to have inflation. We didn't. I mean, not problematic inflation. This is the core consumer price index, core CPI. And what it says is that in recent years, inflation has run between 1.5% and 2.5%. Well, that's just perfect, because the Federal Reserve's target is 2%. In fact, the Federal Reserve has been so unconcerned by inflation that late last year it cut rates not once, not twice, but thrice. The so-called mid-cycle adjustment turned out to be a late-cycle adjustment, even as we're marched to that 50-year low in unemployment. Miracle. Now, though there's a lot of chit-chat about inflation now, again, with federal deficit spending and the Federal Reserve blowing up its balance sheet past now $7 trillion from a pre-crisis level of around $4 trillion, we have disinflation right now. You can see the May inflation report. We have disinflation, and that's because global demand for goods and services has been diminished by the crisis. So when you've got low inflation, you tend to have low interest rates. Here I'm showing you the yield on the 10-year Treasury note. I could show you mortgage rates and other interest rates, but I think you'd agree, even pre-crisis, interest rates were low. The 10-year Treasury yield right now, as I'm speaking to you, is 0.709%. The 2-year yield is 0.192%. Interest rates were low pre-crisis. They're certainly low now. So the best of all worlds, right? I mean, low unemployment, low inflation, low borrowing costs, low cost of capital. So this triggered many outcomes that were positive, like rising property values. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. So more people working, more people making more money on the job, their home values rising, assuming, of course, they own a home. Not everyone does. That triggered these rising home values. For instance, more construction. Some of you are in construction. Home builder confidence coming into the crisis was at a 20-year high. Here I'm graphing for you residential building permits. So as you know, before one builds a significant structure, one has to be issued a permit. They have to pull a permit. So these are permissions. It's the leading indicator. If I'm pulling a permission, it's expressing an intention to build. So you can see, if you look to the right of the slide here, the surge in residential building permits late last year in 2020. Why? Because if you ask realtors pre-crisis, what's going on in the housing market? They would say, look, I got lots of people, thinking about buying a house. I got baby boomers looking to downsize. I got millennials forming households. They're getting married. Some are even having kids. They're thinking about the suburbs. But I got nothing to show them. The inventory of unsold homes is low. So home builders, seeing this, oh, I got high demand, low supply. I have an opportunity to meet unmet demands. I'm confident. So then, of course, as the crisis hits, and literally permitting offices shut down. You couldn't pull a permit because no one's there in the office to allow you to pull a permit. So, predictably, permits fall off the table, and then we get May. In May, what do you see here? Residential building permits pop back up, not to their previous level, but again, whether you're looking at retail sales, permits, jobs, May was a month of recovery for the economy. And then the stock market itself, my goodness. I've got the Dow Jones here on the right, the NASDAQ and the S&P to the left. It's phenomenal. You remember that joke we always used to tell during the Great Recession? I know Marty used to tell this joke a lot. Marty Fletcher of Whiteford Taylor Preston. You remember that joke? Oh, my 401k is on a 201k? Do you remember that joke? By the way, no one ever laughed at that joke, ever. But then the 201k became an 801k. Now, that wasn't funny, but it was fun. I entitled this slide, but it goes to Elvin, as a nod to the fact that, of course, Lord of the Rings has plenty of elves, but also to fully understand the title of this slide, you'd have to harken back to a movie that came out in 1984 called This is Spinal Tap. And if you understand that reference, this becomes hilarious. But if you don't, the point is more people working, more people making more money on the job, their home values rising, assuming they own a home, and their portfolios getting bigger, assuming they have a portfolio. Perfect. And that was a set of circumstances that faced us as we entered 2020. And we went that previous decade without a recession, the first time in American history that we went an entire decade without a recession. We move into 2020 and bam, COVID-19. I must say, however, that though that there was this pre-existing momentum in the economy, and in fact, some economists would have told you as late as early March, we can get through this public health crisis without a recession. Can you believe that? But if you look at quotes from newspapers, you can find quotes from economists, prominent ones, saying, we might be able to get through this without a recession. Nonsense. And one of the reasons that's nonsense, not the only reason, is that even as this economy was growing, there was also a set of vulnerabilities emerging. And I want to talk through those now. So what were these vulnerabilities, these fragilities? Well, number one, not all sectors of the economy were participating in the expansion. Some had been weakened over time by poor performance, like agriculture. Many farmers have had to take on lots of debt because of trade wars, low soybean prices, low corn prices. Many manufacturers stumbled in 2019 as we headed toward this pandemic. This is the Institute of Supply Managers Purchasing Managers Index. And any reading below 50, see the 50-yard line running west east across the slide, any reading below 50 means that manufacturing is in recession, which it was in 2001, but so too was the broader economy, which it was in 08, 09, well, so too was the broader economy. And the same was the case for 5 months in 2019. Why? Trade wars, strong US dollar, which among other things frustrates US export growth, the issues at Boeing, and the fact that the US auto sector peaked around 2016 in terms of activity. Now, what happened late last year? We get that first phase trade with China. We get ratification of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We get Boris Johnson's resounding victory in the United Kingdom, which gave us more certitude regarding Brexit. When was the last time you talked about Brexit? You might have talked about Boris Johnson during the pandemic. Did you talk about Brexit that much? Maybe not. And so with those things happening and the uncertainty revolving around the global supply chain and US manufacturing abating, Actually, the reading on this went above 50 in January to 50.9, but then global supply chain disruptions coming out of China, fears of emerging trade wars or renewed trade wars, and of course the drying up of global demand for goods, you can see manufacturing back in recession, but it was already vulnerable. You might remember that early in the crisis, Boeing raised its hand and says, you know what, we're the Boeing Corporation. We only have one competitor in this entire world, but we're going to need $60 billion. Thank you. Just make the check out to Boeing Inc., certified, and send it to our headquarters in Chicago. But that was why, because of that pre-existing vulnerability. But that's not where the vulnerability ended. I think the greatest source of fragility facing us Americans, and this is beyond the pandemic, but the pandemic has exposed this to a large extent, is indebtedness. What kinds of indebtedness? Well, how about the national debt? This is the US federal budget deficit as a percent of GDP. You see the dark blue colored bars here at the end here? Those forecasts come from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And what it says is even pre-COVID-19, because these forecasts were delivered pre-COVID-19, even pre-COVID-19, we had massive federal budget deficits built into our forecast. We had a $23.5 trillion national debt coming into this crisis. And it's made our response to the crisis awkward. Yes, we've had stimulus, and we'll talk more about that very late in the webinar. But right now we're wrestling in Washington, D.C. with, should we have another one? Now with an unemployment rate of 13.3%, with so many retail workers out of work and restaurant workers, so on and so forth, people who were making entry-level wages at the beginning of the crisis. So they didn't have necessarily a lot of savings. They were vulnerable. You might think, well, it should be easy to get another stimulus package, right? We're still hurting. We want to accelerate this, but we came into this with a $23.5 trillion national debt. And of course, it's gone up by $3 or $4 trillion since the crisis began. But this indebtedness, is well beyond just the federal government. How about the U.S. household sector? Coming into this crisis, households had never been as indebted as they had ever been. They came into the crisis with a record level of aggregate debt. Here I'm showing you various flavors of household debt. Mortgage in orange, in red is student loans, in blue is credit card. So, in March, as the economy is shutting down, at least in parts of the country, so my goodness, I'm not going to be able to make April rent. How am I going to do that? I mean, I've lost my job. My hours have been cut back. But then I know I got a student loan bill coming. I got a credit card bill coming. I got the auto payment due. That's stress. And it was a pre-existing vulnerability, and that was exploited by COVID-19. One vulnerability that has not been fully exploited has been the massive corporate debt that we had generated prior to this crisis. So this is through the end of 2019, but this is U.S. corporate bond debt outstanding. Now here the Federal Reserve has made a big difference, right? Because the Federal Reserve has been buying up corporate debt. And so basically the stock market has looked at that and said, look, I mean, I don't have to worry so much about, a lot of business going out of business, because if you're going to buy their debt and keep their interest rates low. Now, even with that, we've had bankruptcies from J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, J.C. Penney, of course, which was founded in 1902. By 1973, had more than 2,000 stores in America. Obviously, they've had issues in recent decades, and we're down to 850 stores when the crisis struck and when they went into bankruptcy. But still, I mean, the point is the Federal Reserve has really stepped in and sort of solidified those corporate debt markets. We might pay for that in some form or another later on. But a lot of companies have a lot of debt on their balance sheets. You say, Anirban, how is that possible? You just talked, didn't you, sir, about that booming stock market? Isn't it true that we, have seen strong corporate earnings in America in recent years? Isn't it true that we cut corporate taxes in late 2017? Yeah. So haven't corporations had more cash to pay down debt? Sure. But actually what they've often done is leverage that cash into more debt. And one of the ways to do that is to buy back your shares, right? You have fewer shares outstanding after the stock repurchase, your earnings per share goes up, stock price goes up. It's beautiful, except you're left with more leverage on the balance sheet. Also, if you have significant M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions, because those deals are often financed at least partially by debt. Now, that's not where the vulnerability ends. Let's talk about the essence of the American economy. I grew up in Kankakee County, Illinois, on the Indiana border, and yes, it is every bit as exciting as it sounds. And when I was growing up, people would say to me, Anirban, because that's my name, Anirban, America grows 3% on average a year in real terms. 3%. We're a 3% people. That's who we are. Now, if you ask economists like myself, how fast will we grow? I'll say, well, less than 2%. And someone said COVID-19, I'll say less than 2%. Why? Well, look at the third bullet here. U.S. productivity has risen at an average rate of 1.4% since 2007, compared with the 2.2% average since the end of World War II. Economic growth is just productivity growth. Productivity is often measured as output per hour worked plus labor force growth. That's it. Productivity plus labor force growth. That's it. So you lose almost a full percentage point off of potential growth right with that one bullet. But the labor force is not growing the way it once did. Baby boomers are retiring in larger numbers. Our fertility rates are much lower than they used to be. And of course, immigration policy has changed. Ultimately, it is productivity growth that determines people's living standard or growth in living standard over time. Now, you can play games and take on a lot of debt and borrow from the future to raise your current living standard, but you have to pay it back at some point in the future. I know this is a thing that keeps a lot of you up at night or thinking at night. But what is this nation's future going to look like, given that we've amassed so much debt across the board, government, private sector, so on and so forth? Here's another thing. A lot of us are fixated right now on COVID-19, and well, we should be. But there's still other issues emerging from other parts of the world. It's not just virus. And there's still a North Korea. There's still a Middle East. There's still a France, and they can be very rude. This is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Look where I started the slide here, 1998. What were we worried about in 1998? Oh, yes, that's right, Monica Lewinsky. How's she doing? And the world was a simpler place at that time, right? The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union was in tatters, Eastern Europe was regaining its freedom, capitalism and liberal democracy was spreading around the world. Then we get 9/11 in 2001. We get the global financial crisis, 08-09. We get the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, 2011. We get trade war talk in 2016, and then the trade wars become even more serious 2018, 2019, and now COVID-19. So it's a much riskier world. So we often refer to things like COVID-19 as black swans, low probability threats that if they occur, if they transpire, they're low probability, so they probably won't. But if they do, they can change financial market behavior, economic outcomes, lifestyle, so on and so forth. So we get a black swan, but with the world being such an uncertain place, what I'm saying to you is the chance of another black swan is significant. And then finally, coming into this period, another source of vulnerability, stock prices were high coming into this period. What goes up can come down, what goes up a lot can come down a lot. I know one of the things that you're worried about, probably, this is my guess. I haven't met you necessarily. I've met Marty. I love Marty. But one of the things you're worried about is the stock market overdoing it, right? When the S&P is above 3,100, when the Nasdaq's sitting at 10,200, as I speak to you, higher than its all-time high achieved on February 19th, pre-crisis, you're probably ask the question, is it doing too much? But coming into the crisis, it was high. This is the Shiller price earnings ratio. What I'm trying to do for you here is I'm trying to juxtapose the value of, or the price of shares on the S&P 500 vis-a-vis their underlying corporate earnings. And all this is saying basically is pre-crisis, share prices were high relative to earnings. Not as high as they were in March of 2000, just before the dot-com bust, but high. And as I say, what goes up can come down, what goes up a lot can come down a lot. Now again, don't get me wrong, there is some justification behind this phenomenal stock market run of the previous decade. Something very special happened in America during the previous decade. Yes, we did not have a recession, but something else happened. For decades, America's share of global output declined. And some of that was engineered by whom? The Americans. It was the Americans who fashioned the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe post-World War II. It was the Americans who spent some of their own treasure to help accelerate Japanese economic recovery from World War II, to try to turn our sworn enemies into our future trading partners, and boy, did it work. Germany today is the fourth largest economy in the world. Japan is third. Italy is eighth. But something very special happened in the previous decade. Our share of global output actually rose from 23% at the beginning of the previous decade to 25% by decade's end. I know we've got some issues in America. We've seen it on the streets of America in recent weeks. We know we've got this national debt, our broken infrastructure, our broken politics. But we are home to less than 5% of the world's population and a quarter of its output. We're still doing something right. We're still doing something right. We have created companies like Apple and Sun Microsystems and Google and Boeing and so on and so forth, though that might be a bad example. But does this performance, as remarkable as it is, justify this performance? This is stock market returns by country or region 2010 to 2019. Now, you may not agree with anything I've said thus far, but I think you would agree with the proposition that a decade has 10 years. See, look at that red bar there, America's stock market return for the previous decade, 256%. Divide that by 10, and you get a back of the envelope calculation with respect to the annual rate of return on stock market investment in America. It's not off the charts because it's on the chart, but you get what I mean. India, a year that pre-COVID-19 will grow 6% during a really bad economic year in real terms. But you wouldn't know that from the stock market performance. That's true of emerging markets generally, which generally grow faster in the United States. So whether I showed to you in absolute terms, price earnings ratio, or in relative terms, like I'm showing you here, the stock market is pretty pricey coming into this crisis, and I think it's pretty pricey now. You may disagree. Again, there was this naivete coming to the crisis that maybe we'll get through this without a recession. That this economy has so much momentum, the consumer is in such a good position, the stock market is booming, property values are rising, that there's this is an irresistible force, but that irresistible force hit an immovable object, and that immovable object is COVID-19, and it's just different economically. A lot of attempts by people, including economists, to compare this to other episodes in economic history. I've heard a lot of comparison between this from a stock market perspective at October of 1987. Some people compared this to 9/11. I was on a webinar about a month ago with a very prominent national economist aligned with the U.S. housing industry who said he saw this as basically Hurricane Katrina and its effect on New Orleans in 2005, something like that, but nationwide. Nonsense. And it certainly is not like 2008, 2009. Oh no, that was a demand shock. What happened? The money disappeared. From where? Everywhere. Stock market accounts, household balance sheets, bank balance sheets, home values. The money just dried up in the economy. And so what did we do? I mean, the air came out of the balloon. What did we do? We just pumped air back in the balloon. We just increased money supply, right? We had the Troubled Assets Relief Program, recapitalized the banks. We blew up the Federal Reserve's balance sheet from $800 billion pre-crisis to $4.5 trillion. I'm talking about the Great Recession now. And that worked, didn't it? I mean, we had the lengthiest economic expansion in American history, one that would be continuing were it not for COVID-19, with low inflation. I mean, I think you could argue it was a victory. But this is different. This is no demand shock. This is a supply shock of a caliber unknown in modern times. This is quarantines, travel bans and restrictions, closure of public places. You and I can't shake hands. Heck, we can't be less than 6 feet apart. And if we are, we better be wearing masks. That's factory closures and supply chain disruptions. The economy never had a shot. It did not matter what the pre-existing momentum was. It never had a shot. This could have happened in 2009, and it would have brought the economy, to a screeching halt. Now, the stock market had less to fall back then, but the point is, it's a supply shock. Now, when you lose 20.7 million jobs in April, right? When people are losing their jobs and businesses are going out of business and storefronts are empty and restaurants are shuttered and malls are vacated, that in and of itself triggers a follow-on demand shock. So there's that loss of confidence, loss of income, so on and so forth. But the cure here doesn't come really from the federal government. The cure doesn't come from the Federal Reserve. The cure comes from Regeneron, Gilead Sciences, Pfizer, Merck, Sanofi-Aventis, Novartis, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Bayer AG. Somebody please come up with a vaccine, but that's the cure. Now, this is the worst quarter of our lives economically. And though many economists were slow to understand the nature of this crisis, they get it now. I mean, look at the second quarter forecast here. JP Morgan Chase economists, 40% decline in GDP for the second quarter on an annualized basis. Conference Board, roughly 40%. Goldman Sachs, 39%, so on and so forth. By comparison to the worst quarter of the Great Recession in late 2008, the economy shrank 8.4%. That was a baby compared to this thing. Of course, some people have fared worse than others. Some of us are lucky. We can work remotely, right? We haven't suffered job loss. We may not have even suffered loss of income. But, about 30 or 33% of us can work remotely. but you know, a lot of folks can't, you know, and so the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis conducted a study and delivered that study in late March, just as things were really getting awful economically, um, about who was most vulnerable. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because I want to get to Q&A, and I've only got like 5 minutes before we get to that. But you look at the second bolded row here: employed in occupations at high risk of layoff. You know, of the 144.7 million jobs captured in that study, 67 million roughly were deemed high risk, or 46% of all jobs. And who are they? People in food preparation, that's your restaurant worker. People in sales, that's your worker at the mall. Now these malls are starting to reopen. I noticed in Maryland they're starting to reopen. Towson Town Center is open. About 2 weeks ago, my family discovered that the Urban Outfitters in Towson was open, Towson, Maryland. And so guess 2 weeks ago, who was having a great time at the Urban Outfitters in Towson, Maryland? Oh yeah, my wife and 2 daughters having a great time. Who was having a miserable time at Urban Outfitters 2 weeks ago? Me. Ghastly. So things are starting to come back, but you know, it's not going to come back very quickly because there's going to be a lot of small businesses that will not come back to this. So because some of those monthly and quarterly data have not been quick to catch on to how devastating this has been, we've been looking at high frequency data like initial unemployment insurance claims, which I'm graphing for you here. Now the blue segment here is pre-crisis. We're running around 210,000 claims per week, 210,000. We had 2 weeks consecutively, including the week ended March 28th, where we had more than 6.5 million claims for 2 consecutive weeks. That's more than 13 million claims over 2 weeks. Now you say, well, there's good news here, Anirban. For the week ending June 13th, only 1.5 million claims. 1.5 million is still a massive total. And you can see the pace at which claims are declining is not declining as quickly. Now, that said, this can be misleading. Why? Because it is conceivable that somebody could lose a job today, successfully file for unemployment insurance tomorrow, and then get a job the next day. I'm not saying it happens often, it's conceivable. So what might matter more is continuing claims. How many people are on unemployment insurance right now across the United States? Well, that's this graph, continuing claims. And you can see we're already past the peak. Am I concerned about what's happening in Arizona and Texas and Florida right now? Oh, you better believe it. Because those are large economies. And if they have to shut down, just as New York and Detroit and other places shut down earlier in the crisis, well, my goodness. But for right now, Governor DeSantis in Florida and elsewhere is saying, no, just, maybe you should put on a mask. I'm going to keep this economy going. So we'll see what this looks like. And we'll talk more about what this means for the shape of the recovery. In fact, let's talk about that right now, because I think everyone on this call understood that the economy was in bad shape coming into this crisis. Your question is probably what? What's it going to look like in a few months? So let's talk about that. Now, this comes from Oxford Economics. It's their global economic forecast. And the reason I'm using Oxford Economics is that I have a lot of respect for their forecasting. They bring a lot of common sense to their forecasting of global and national economies, and common sense is not common in forecasting. The red line here, and this is an index, the red line here represents their January forecast. And it's an index so that the fourth quarter of 2019 is set equal to 100. And what it shows is basically that pre-COVID-19, what was the forecast? Smooth economic growth for the global economy through 2023. That's what this shows. The blue line represented the current forecast as of May. Right? So that was what there's. And what do you see here? Oh, the sharp dip in global economic activity, of course, and then a sharp bounce back. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the letter V, V for victory. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be a V-shaped recovery because Oxford Economics says so. I like the validation. Validation also begins with the letter V. I'm saying it because that's the way it has been when we've had prior pandemics in advanced economies. This comes from Goldman Sachs. Too many lines on here by half. So just fixate, if you would, on one for me. The blue line that goes way down and then back up again. Hong Kong, 2003 SARS. Hong Kong, 2003 SARS. That blue line goes way up and back down. You see the skinny black line at 0%? That's pre-existing economic growth. Pre-existing economic growth. So as the pandemic strikes the economy, or epidemic, growth goes below that prevailing average. Well, of course it does, as retail is affected, and then construction and financial services and manufacturing and so on and so on. I mean, things get worse before they get better. The line goes down before it goes back up. But then what do you see? This is historical data, a sharp bounce back in economic activity. You see the letter V there. You see a lot of V's on this chart. And so 2.5 million jobs added in May, 17% growth in retail sales in May, sharp bounce back in permanent activity. I would argue to you that the low point for this economy occurred in late April. Why? Based on what? Based on mobility data. You can actually track how mobile people are based on their cell phones. And that's when mobility in America hit its nadir, in late April. Because at that point, Georgia's opening back up and Florida's starting to open back up. So we can argue it was too soon. But the economic consequences of that you could see in May. And by the way, another reason I think it's going to be a V is this: we've got so much stimulus in the pipeline. I mean, this time Congress didn't wait. I mean, during the Great Recession, you might remember the first vote on TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program, was a negative, and the stock market collapsed. This time, even before Rudy Gobert is diagnosed, the Utah Jazz rush from basketball, even before that 2,000-point dip on the Dow on March 9th, phase one, March 6th. 12 days later, phase two, $192 billion plan. 9 days later, phase three, that's the CARES Act. This is how quickly they moved. $2.2 trillion. Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And if that was not enough, less than a month later, phase four, more money for the Paycheck Protection Program and other things, a $500 billion package roughly. And are we going to get a phase five? Oh, I think so. Why? It's a presidential election year. And both parties want to look sympathetic to the American people. I'm not saying they are or aren't. I'm saying they want to look that way. So yeah, state, local governments are going to get some assistance, and we may get some infrastructure spending on this next one as well. So that takes me to my final slide, the one forecast. Look, the initial phase of this recovery from this crisis will be sharp, profound, and most welcome. But when I say a V, it's an awkward V, please understand. A V is comprised of two linear segments of equal length. This is not that V. This is a V in which that first segment, the one that points downward, is lengthier than the one that goes back up. Complete recovery will take years because you're going to have fewer small businesses, more empty storefronts, shattered commercial real estate coming out of this period. But that said, as people re-enter this economy, re-engage this economy, they'll find low interest rates. They'll find pent-up demand is high for things like automobiles. Right? You got 0% financing for 84 months. You got dealerships with almost no cars sitting on them in some cases. So they're going to have to rebuild their inventories. And we're human beings, and people are anxious to meet again. Go to restaurants. They want to go to casinos. You see what happened when Las Vegas opened up its casinos? Lines around the buildings. They want to see a movie, and not on Netflix and not at home. They want to watch the Baltimore Orioles, which is the most beautiful thing a human being can do, short of nurturing a child, and engage in other most wonderful human activities. I've been saying, since March it was going to be a V, and I will say May's jobs report was an absolute stunner even to me. One way to look at this is that it's saying that economists missed the mark by 10.5 million jobs. Another way to look at it is that economists missed it by 2 weeks. The economy came back faster, people re-engaged faster than many of us thought. I didn't expect a loss of 8 million jobs, by the way, in May, but I also did not expect the 2.5 million jobs that we added. But look, while recovery has begun, I admit these remain treacherous times, especially because of what's happening in Florida, Texas, Arizona. And we'll see. Come on, Gilead Sciences. Come on, Pfizer. Come on, Novartis. Come on, somebody. Moderna. Please, vaccine, so we can get back to living the way we love to live. And with that, I'm done with this preliminary comments, and we'll take questions and answers for our remaining time together. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Anirban. One of the questions, and we've received a lot of questions, and we're trying to blend them together into common themes. One of the questions we received is, we're starting to see an economic bounce back. What do you see as the things that aren't going to bounce back? What are the permanent trends that are going to be embedded in the economy after this crisis?
Yeah, I think you're going to see much differential use of commercial space. So that's retail space, that's hotel conference rooms, that's office space, of course, including Class A office space. Class A office space was a big winner during the upturn, during the expansion, because, yeah, first of all, companies were doing well so they could afford better quality space. Second, there's CEO egos all the time, right? People want to lease really nice space, come to work in that space. But then three, it was a recruitment tool and a retention tool, right? So if the problem is that I can't find enough knowledge workers, I need to more effectively recruit, whether to Baltimore, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, whatever it happens to be, Lexington, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky. If I need to do that, then when the interviewee comes into my office space, I want them to see a success address. And I want them to say, oh, I'd love to work here. This is beautiful. Where do I sign? But now with unemployment above 13% and with the class of 2020 lost in terms of its economic prospects for many people, you're going to see a move back to Class B space. So demand for new construction is going to be down. You're going to see some retrofitting of Class B space, but you're probably going to see more vacancy in Class A space, that kind of thing. Malls are going to be problematic in many cases. Gyms are going to be problematic, right? Because so many of us bought Peloton bikes or some substitutes for Peloton bikes during the crisis, right? Stay at home for 4 months. You need exercise equipment at home. So we did that. What do we need a gym membership for? Maybe we do need it, right? Because we're trying to meet people. But we've got the exercise stuff at home, and then, look, how many of us have been ordering from Grubhub or DoorDash, so on and so forth, So some things are going to get a boost, right? E-commerce got a boost. That's obvious. So that means more fulfillment centers. That means more data centers. I think there's going to be more investment in our hospitals because we didn't have enough ICU beds. We didn't have enough ventilators. We've been underinvesting in our hospitals for decades. That might be a place where we're going to see more investment going forward. So winners and losers, big winners, big losers. And that's, by the way, what you see in the stock market, right? Because the NASDAQ is largely led by a handful of companies that are really big winners. But a lot of these companies aren't going anywhere in terms of stock value right now.
Anirban, one of the reasons employment has bounced back so strongly is the PPP loan program to small businesses, which was very widely participated in. And in fact, our clients and our attorneys work with our clients to access those funds. What's your concern that when those PPP funds run out and that impact on the economy?
Right. So here's the thing: the economics around PPP or Paycheck Protection Program are really complicated because you might remember that when people were taking those loans, everyone was thinking about, I want my loans to be forgiven, and to be forgiven, I've got to keep my staff. So what the PPP may have done actually is limited job loss in late March into April and May. It would have been even worse but for PPP because a lot of people said, I got to hold on to my staff. Otherwise, this loan will not be forgiven. So now they've changed the rules, and or the rules are changing seemingly daily in terms of loan forgiveness, and you don't need to do this X, Y, and Z to be forgiven. So what you might see come the June jobs reports, which will be issued early in July, is that actually layoff activity picks up a bit because all of a sudden to get forgiveness, you don't have to hold on to as many workers. So that's one. But something else is happening at the same time, Marty, that further complicates the situation, the computation here, because we've had significant unemployment insurance benefits as well. So the federal government has been offering a $600, as you know, per week subsidy on top of state unemployment insurance benefits. That ends in July. So what happened is, early in the crisis, a lot of employers said to their employees, I'm doing you a favor by laying you off so you can go out and get those generous unemployment insurance benefits. I'll see you in August. So as those unemployment insurance benefits run out in July, what you're going to see is a lot of workers who are sort of not really doing aggressive job searches right now come streaming back into the economy. So while the June jobs report is a big question mark to me, I think by July and August, you'll see a lot of job creation as people really come back to the job market in earnest because they've collected the federal unemployment insurance benefits and they know that's running out.
The next question we have, Anirban, deals with all this debt that the government's taking on and kind of the surprising lack of inflation. Is that possible in the U.S. now just because the rest of the world is struggling even more?
Well, yes. I mean, part of it is we are importing this inflation. So oil prices, are $40.33 in North America as I'm speaking to you. That's less than the pre-crisis level. Right? So, we've seen, global demand shrink. The global economy will shrink around 6% this year based on International Monetary Fund forecasts and other forecasts. So, you have less demand for goods and services. That's disinflationary, if not deflationary. So that's what we experience. We haven't really talked about inflation in this country as a significant problem for 4 decades. And there's lots of reasons for this. Part of this is Paul Volcker, our Federal Reserve chairman in the early 1980s, who wrung inflation out of the economy. Part of it is globalization, right? We've benefited, at least along that dimension, from having access to lower cost Chinese workers, Mexican workers, Bangladeshi workers, so on and so forth, globalization. but now global supply chains are fragmenting. And I would say that in a year or two, one of the number one issues that people will be talking about, and I hope to do a webinar about it at that time, is inflation. Because when you've got so much money supply creation and when you've got fragmenting globalization, that serves as a recipe for more inflation. So right now it's disinflation, but watch out, in a year or two, we could be seeing inflation, not like we did in the 1970s, not that level, but enough inflationary pressure such that the Federal Reserve is having to tighten monetary policy, even though economic recovery is far from complete.
Could you comment a little bit on the health of our cities and municipalities? We hear that there's a demand by governors and cities for them to receive a bailout. Is that going to be forthcoming? And if it isn't, what do you foresee happening?
Well, I mean, it's a tough one, Marty, because you're trying to predict. One is trying to predict a political outcome, and obviously that's difficult. But I would say, based on the politics of an election year, it's quite likely we're going to get another stimulus. Now, Congress is not active right now, right? They don't get really back until July. But in July, one of their first first activities or first set of activities will focus around another stimulus for state and local governments. And again, there might be an infrastructure component to that as well. Borrowing costs are low right now. I mean, the 10-year yield right now is 0.709% as I'm talking to you right now. So the federal government doesn't have to balance its budget every year, and they can borrow cheaply right now and give money, grant money to state and local governments, including for infrastructure. And state and local governments have to balance their budget every year. And we do not want to hear stories, and I'm sure both parties are concerned about this, stories about teachers, firefighters, garbage collectors, police officers losing their jobs before we go into the polls in November. So I think that there's going to be some support fiscally from the federal government for state and local governments. And again, my hope is there's actually an infrastructure component as well, because our infrastructure in this country is so broken. And there's an opportunity here for the federal government to do something that has permanent and lingering economic effect.
So last question here, Anirban. What is the one statistic? We are flooded with statistics and data from all sources. What's the one statistic that you're really watching and that our audience should really be watching over the summer that will tell us the direction of things?
Number of states that are still open. That's it. Number of states that are still open in the summer and obviously into the fall, right? Because everyone's talking about the viral spread in the fall. The virus likes colder temperatures and lower humidity, and that's what you get in October, November, December. It likes people sneezing and coughing, and spreading things through respiratory droplets. So that's what I'm watching. That's number one thing. Now you say economic statistic, about what's the statistic? I'm looking at things like restaurant reservations. I'm looking at things like airplane reservations, right? Because that's what tells me the economy is getting back to normal. When people are going out to restaurants again, watching movies, getting on an airplane. So what I want to see going forward now is more and more people deciding, I'm going to take that vacation. I'm going to get on that Southwest or United or Delta flight. I'm going to stay in a hotel, right? I know I've got to get into an elevator, something I don't have to do at home, but I'm going to get an elevator with strangers, and I'm okay with that. So that's what I'm watching for from an economic perspective. Mobility, restaurant reservations, those kinds of high frequency data. I'm not waiting for GDP that comes out once a quarter. I'm not waiting for job growth that comes out once every month and it's subject to revision. Give me restaurant reservations, and that will tell me everything I need to know for the next few months.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time today, Anirban. Thank you to all of our guests. We wish you all a wonderful summer, and we wish you all much good fortune as our economy recovers. Thank you.